I invite you to open up your Bibles this morning to Galatians chapter 6, and we'll be looking there to begin in just a moment. Appreciate Michael reading that passage for us, and we'll be looking at that as well as another context to consider a phrase this morning. The phrase, at least in the New King James Version there in Galatians 6 and verse 9, as well as over in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 13, is do not grow weary. Particularly, brethren, do not grow weary in doing well or doing good. And I want to think about that. I have, on occasion, at various points, shared with you my feelings of discouragement. And I want to say that as I have felt that at various points, where I have felt weariness, I felt exhausted at times, discouraged, I don't share that with you to solicit sympathy or comfort, though you have offered it, and I appreciate that. That's not why I bring that up this morning. I bring it up more by way of confession, to tell you that that's where I get, and I need what God has to say to me. And so, as in so many cases, this sermon is directed at me. I'm preaching what I need in hopes that you need it as well, because I imagine that a great many people feel weariness and discouragement. In fact, I've seen that. I've seen lots of people communicating that. So I'm just so tired. I'm so done with it all. I'm so fill in the blank. And those are phrases that communicate weariness. What does Paul say about that? What does he say here in Galatians chapter 6? What does he say over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3? I want to begin by just looking at the word weariness and what we can learn from that. It's interesting as you do a word study on weariness. I want this to be an encouraging lesson for anyone who feels weary, but I think that there's some balance that is needed as we look at the various places where that word shows up throughout the New Testament in particular. And so in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, as we begin there, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, it says in the New American Standard, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. In the New King James, it says, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not lose heart. And so those are two different Greek words there. The lose heart and weary, or weary and lose heart. It's two different Greek words. But obviously the translators struggle to figure out the nuance such that the New King James and the New American Standard translators just swapped them out and said this one could mean either one of those and this one could mean either one of those. And so as we look, first of all, at the word there, lose heart, at the first of those words in Galatians 6 and verse 9, that's the same word that's over in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. 2 Thessalonians, where we find this same phrase, Paul using this same phrase to the brethren there. He says there, but as for you, brethren, do not grow weary of doing good. Well, over in Luke chapter 18 and verse 1 is another place that word is used that I think gives us some insight into its meaning. Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, it says, now he was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not lose heart. And this is a weariness, this is a type of weariness that every time we see it occur in the New Testament, somebody's telling us to not have that. Don't go there. And the idea is giving up. Don't get to the point where you give up. So, don't give up on doing good, he says. Along with that, the second word there in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9 that we looked at, whether it's in the New American Standard translated weariness or if it's in the New King James translated losing heart, it's the idea of fainting. In fact, it's literal fainting in some contexts. Over in Matthew chapter 15 and in verse 32, in Matthew chapter 15 and in verse 32, it says there Jesus called his disciples and said, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. That's that same word for weariness there in the second part of Galatians 6 and verse 9. And so here's people that just don't have enough sustenance, and they're going to pass out. So spiritually, he said, don't pass out. Don't lose consciousness. Stay with me. I remember going to the doctor after I had cut my finger off, and one of the things he told me as I was sitting there filling out information and holding on to my finger with a dish rag, and he said, he was asking me questions. I said, listen, I will answer all of your questions, but you're going to have to do something for me because I'm going to pass out. And he said, well, I need you not to pass out. You're going to have to give me more than that. That admonition isn't going to cut it. I think we feel that sometimes spiritually. That just the admonition, don't faint, it doesn't cut it. I need some sustenance. I need to be built up. I need some relief. Well, then finally, along these lines, there is the word weariness that is found, for instance, in Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12 and in verse 3, there it says, for consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. That lose heart's one of the words that we've already looked at. But the weariness here is to be sick, to almost be physically ill with exhaustion. That's the way that it's translated over in James chapter 5 and verse 15 in many of our Bibles. In James chapter 5 and in verse 15, where it's talking about this one who is weak and overtaken with perhaps spiritual weakness. It says in verse 15, the prayer offered in faith will restore the one who is sick. It's that idea of the person who's just overcome with weariness. And the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, they will be forgiven him. And so in all of these cases, these first three instances of words that we find translated weariness, the Bible is very clear in saying, don't get to that point. Do what it takes to avoid getting to that point. Now, Matthew 11 and verse 28. That is where the balance comes in. In Matthew 11 and in verse 28, he says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. In this particular instance, Jesus points to a weariness that he wants to relieve. If you are weary, then I will give you rest. And this is an interesting word because in other places it's translated as work or toil, and it is the kind of toil that just wears you out. I mean, you're just exhausted after you put in this kind of labor. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 4, and in verse 10, Paul writes, therefore it is for this we labor and strive, because we have fixed our hope on the living God, who is the Savior of all men, especially of believers. That word labor here is the same word Jesus uses for those who are weary. And so it is the idea of, for this we labor to weariness. That's the idea of what Paul is saying there. This is why we do this. You can imagine Timothy saying, this is exhausting. And Paul says, do you know why we work until we're exhausted? Because we got a prize that we're pushing towards, and we keep our eyes on it. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Look back to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and in verse 12. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and in verse 12, he says, but we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction. And particularly, I think he's talking about the leadership roles. And so those men who take up those roles and work to exhaustion, appreciate them. We have some men who've been working here to exhaustion. And women too, who've been working to exhaustion. And we appreciate the efforts and the work that they're putting in. But he doesn't say don't work like that. He says appreciate those who work like that, which is different than these other types of exhaustion or weariness. Ephesians 4 and verse 28, we get even more generic there with the instructions. Ephesians 4 and verse 28, He says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor. He must labor. That's everyone. Must labor performing with his own hands what is good, so he will have something to share with one who has need. Don't take the easy route. Don't be a thief. No, you go out and you work hard. What kind of hard work? The kind that Jesus says produces weariness. You work to weariness in order to gain sustenance, in order to have for yourself and also to share with others. And so the balance is, on the one hand, he says, don't get to this point, don't faint, don't fall away, give up. But at the same time, Jesus is saying, come to me, you who are weary. Why are they weary? Because they've been doing what they ought to do. Working hard to exhaustion, to weariness. I think there's just a real balance there that we need to keep in mind. As the Apostle Paul would talk about his labors, for instance, over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and in verse 15, where he says, I will most gladly spend and be expended for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? Paul says, I want to wear myself out in service to my brethren. It's a noble sentiment, and it is a lofty goal for us to set before ourselves. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, though, there is the balance to that as well. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10, he says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me did not prove vain, but I labored, that's that weariness, that labor to weariness. I labored even more than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God with me. And so I think that takes us back to Matthew chapter 11, which is Jesus says, if you're weary, come to me, and I'll give you rest. I'll give you sustenance. I'll keep you from fainting. I'll give you the mercy that you need and the grace that you need to keep you going. I'm reminded then, for instance, of the Beatitudes, in which we have these balancing statements that we begin by talking about those who are poor in spirit. And at some level, we want to recognize that Christians need not remain in that state of mind. Like there's something that gives us confidence so that we don't have to remain in that sort of desperate mode of poverty. And so he says, but if you don't have that, if you don't come to me with that, then you can't get the relief. We want to hunger and thirst. Why? So that he can satisfy that hungering and thirsting. We want to mourn. Why? So that he can comfort us. And there's just real, I think, tension that is there in those Beatitudes, where if we ever get to the point that we lose the sense of why we ought to mourn, then we will stop being comforted. Arrogance will set in. And yet, what he doesn't want is Christians who go around with a long face and drenched in sorrow. He wants us to exude that we have been comforted. So you got to keep that balance. I think that's sort of the way it is in weariness. You work hard. It's not, let me tell you a way where you don't get exhausted anymore. That's not it. It's, let me tell you how to get exhausted and then where to go with that exhaustion. And then we got to maintain that balance, that we consistently work towards that end and consistently lean on God so that we don't get burned out, so that we don't get so discouraged that we give up, that we faint, that we become sick with sorrow and exhaustion. No, we come to the one who promises that he will make that burden light. Well, I'd like to take the context, a couple of the contexts that we see that phrase, do not grow weary, and look at that, just two elements that I think are helpful to me in sort of avoiding the weariness that we ought to avoid. And the first of those elements in those contexts is that weariness comes when we don't stay focused on our duty, on our responsibility. And so if you look over at Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 is where he tells them to not grow weary in doing good, for in due time we will reap reward if we do not grow weary. Verse 10, so then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. The footnote in the New American Standard says, as we have opportunity. When opportunity presents itself, you take advantage of it. You look for those opportunities, you grab hold of those opportunities, and you do good. But there is a limitation to that. And he doesn't extend past the opportunity that is before you. And that principle is illustrated in Matthew 25, for instance, with the parable of the talents. The expectations are consistent with the talents that are possessed, with the opportunity that's possessed by each servant. And there is not an expectation that the one-talent man would be able to accomplish something that only the five-talent man could accomplish. And so we stay within our boundaries. We stay within what is possible, what we're capable of doing. Over in 2 Thessalonians, the context there, I think, drives that point home further. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, and beginning in verse 11, he says, for we hear that some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies. Now such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ to work in quiet fashion and eat their own bread. But as for you, brethren, do not grow weary of doing good. I just think about that. That there are people who are going around doing no work at all but acting like busybodies. I think that's a pretty good description of social media. It keeps us from doing any work at all and being concerned about what everybody else is doing and being busybodies. It's interesting, the word here for busybody. He says they're doing no work at all. That's a word, ergazomai. So you see that erg there, that energy. And then the word busybody is the same word with the prefix peri. Now, peri, perimeter, it's the idea you're working around the work. You're doing everything else but the work. You're never quite getting to that. And so he says, that's what you need to be working on. Looking a little bit further along those lines, I think that contrast there in verse 12, instead of working around and focusing on everything else, he says that they ought to work in a quiet fashion and eat their own bread. That just sounds so familiar to the writer of Ecclesiastes, to what Solomon has to say. You know what I found is good for a man? To do his work, to eat his own bread, to have a good night's rest. And it's hard to beat that, is what Solomon says. And here's Solomon with a great many more talents than you and I, and a great many more capacities than you and I. And what he finds is that he is writing a letter in total weariness saying, I could not fix the problems. And he's appealing to us, please don't think that you're going to be able to fix all the problems. That idea of personal responsibilities. We certainly want to make sure we are taking advantage of the opportunities. And we press on the one hand when we look at the parable of the talents, the need to evaluate our talents and know when we are slacking and when we are being lazy. And listen, I am very prone to that, to laziness. And I have to be very careful that I recognize. Some people ask me about my schedule, and if I tell them what the schedule is on a given day, they want, how do you maintain that? And And the answer is, I don't always. I do let weariness set in. And I don't stick to and take advantage of the opportunities that are before me. And one of the reasons that I have to stick to a strict schedule is because if I don't, I will devolve into a lazy couch potato. So I want to be pressing people to make sure they're moving on, but I think there's a place in our society for reining people in and saying, but wait a minute. Recognize the limits of your opportunity as much as the abundance of your opportunity. So again, balance. I'm pushing and I'm pulling. Do more. Wait. That's more than you're capable of. Now you're being a busybody. And I think it's a pretty constant thing for us. That we're trying to figure out what all should I be responsible for? What should I not be responsible for? And particularly right now, I was talking to my granddad about all the ebbs and flows of society that he's lived through. And preaching in the midst of all of that. And one of the things that he said to me was, we didn't have everybody's thoughts delivered to us 24/7 around the clock. He said, it makes it harder. More people can cause more trouble than at a quicker rate than ever before. And to this point of mind your own business, I saw a quote this week, and I don't know anything about the guy that it came from, but I thought it was so on the nose. He said, could it be that God didn't wire us to carry every event taking place in every part of the world at every moment as if it were ours? Could it be that technology has produced a faux omniscience and omnipresence that is hurting mankind and not helping it? I absolutely think that's the case. I saw a woman screaming at a police officer this week on a video, and someone pointed out to her the irony of a white woman screaming in a black man's face because the police officer was black and she was white. She's screaming at his face and telling him he's part of the problem, and his mother would be ashamed of him, his children are going to be ashamed of him. And somebody with a camera said, I don't know if you realize what this looks like, but it's a very peculiar way to fight racism. And she screamed in his face, she said, I, as a white person, racism is my problem and I must fix it. And I was like, well, that's right. Right here. You trying to fix it in that man's heart and you hadn't even got it here. Good for you. Sometimes we think, I'm not doing enough. It may be. And we need to evaluate that. But we also need to evaluate, maybe I'm trying to do too much. Sometimes people will say things like, it's not enough for you to just try to go along and be a shining light and be a Christian. Let me just suggest to you, that is more than enough for me to try to get a hold of. I'll let you know when I got that down. And I'm ready to fix the rest of the world. And Paul says, it's enough. Do your work. Eat your bread. And be content. And be careful that you don't become the crusader to fix everybody else and not yourself. The other thing that I think keeps us from being weary, aside from minding our business, making sure we're working where we actually have the capacity to make changes in our own lives, is that we keep our eye on the prize. And again, going back to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9, this is what he points to there. He says, we will reap if we do not grow weary. He says earlier that God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. And so what do you do to keep energized? You look for what's coming. That's what the farmer does, and he's pointing to the farmer here. The Hebrew writer points to Jesus. Jesus himself, in order not to faint and grow weary and give up before he gets to the cross, what does he do? He looks to the joy set before him. He looks to the reward. That's what sustains him. And I think for any of us, when we get discouraged, one of the main reasons we get discouraged is we fail to grab full hold of the reality of heaven, the certainty of it, and to dwell on that. Sometimes, even when we've got our focus where we ought to, we still grow weary, and I think maybe that's because we don't see the results of our labor. We're looking for the reward before the harvest. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 6, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 6, he says, the hardworking farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. What is he talking about? It's the crops at the end of this life. And he'll get his crops. He'll receive the harvest. But it's not, you can't rush it. You can't force those plants to grow any faster than they will. So, are you engaged in that struggle? Are you dealing with that difficulty? I want to just think about this. I was talking with a young couple who is from another congregation that's come and asked for some counseling. They're dealing with sexual immorality and trying to exercise self-control. And so I asked them, I said, could you exercise self-control if I told you that if you did, at the end of the week, I would give you $5? They said, I don't know. $5 is not much. I said, I get that. What would you be willing to do if I said I give you $100 at the end of the week? And they said, well, now we're talking. What if I told you at the end of the week, I give you $1 million? They said, we wouldn't even look at each other. That's right. If you had a guarantee that at the end of some degree of time, you were guaranteed some massive reward, you'd do whatever it took. To these young people who want to get married one day, and that day's not so far off, maybe a year and a half. What if I give you $1 million at the end of a year and a half? They said, we could do that. What if I give you heaven? And I think we just see heaven as less tangible because we're willing to go through a lot of pain and struggle and frustration for rewards that are so much less. You see what people put in. We were talking about, med students the other day. Why? Why would you go through that? Well, you want to be a doctor and you want to help people, but you want a paycheck. And let me just say, if you go through all that, you want a pretty big paycheck. And I don't begrudge them that. But that's why a lot of people are doing that. Is they're looking, they're going sleepless night, they're working crazy, insane hours, and you say, how? Because hopefully it'll work out and they'll get a good paycheck. But here, God's saying, stay with me. Focus on me. Pay attention to the good deeds, the everyday, ordinary holiness that I'm calling you to, and I'll give you heaven. And it ought to be, we say, you got it. And that does make it easier. I know in my house, when there's struggles, when our children are struggling to keep up with their responsibilities, all we need to do is put something there at the end and say, if you will maintain civility for the rest of this week, we'll go out to eat at Chewy's. And for this, they can be kind. I hope that we can be kind to one another because we'll get to see Jesus. I hope that we can endure the frustrations and the weariness because we get to be with God in His very presence. Romans chapter 8 and verse 18. Paul is writing to people who are bowed down with sorrows so tremendously greater than ours, it is not worthy to have them in the same conversation. But he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." I can just imagine people responding to Paul and thinking, "Yes, but Paul, you don't know what I'm going through." And I don't. Paul says, "I don't care what they are. It doesn't matter. You cannot spell out a struggle so great that God says it will not be small in comparison to what I'm offering you. It just cannot." And so we really have to do some work on contemplating the reality of the reward and realizing that that's the realest thing that we will ever experience. The most joy we will ever experience. And if there's any reward here that would motivate us, hold heaven in higher regard. What about you? Are you weary? If you are able to blithely say, "Not at all," well, maybe that's not as good as you think it is. There does need to be some weariness. You need to be experiencing that so that you can bring that to Jesus. "Come to me, you who are weary." If you're not weary, just like you're not sick, you're not blind, you don't need him. So there needs to be some weariness. On the other hand, if you are weary because you have taken on more than God has called you to take on, then I urge you to set down the excess baggage this morning and turn your attention to where your greatest opportunities actually sit. And finally, are you confident in your reward? Do you think in concrete terms about the joy that awaits you? Ultimately, when we are working as we ought, we are the kind of exhausted, when we are the kind of exhausted we ought to be, then heaven is what makes it possible to maintain and sustain that day after day after day. But if you have no confidence of that reward, let me just tell you, I don't know how you maintain. And I think people don't. And I think people are desperate for some hope. And if you're here this morning and you don't have that hope, I hope that you might take advantage. I hope you might grab hold of that. And you might see that what God is laying out here is more precious than anything this world could ever possibly offer you. And even if the world is offering you something, understand it will disappoint you. God will not. Take hold of the only thing that lasts. If there's any way we can help you with that this morning, why don't you come forward while we stand.